Everyone. This is our presentation on the Constitution and some particular topics within it regarding how it outlines certain powers, amendments, and laws. Outlined list of the contents of this presentation. First up, we have the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment states that anything in the Constitution that isn't explicitly laid out as a federal power gets defaulted back to the states to decide. For example, driver's license and marriage laws are states' issues. This topic is discussed in section 2.5 under key constitutional changes in the textbook. And in section 4.4, an interesting point they made was that some people argue that the 10th Amendment can be used as interposition or nullification by blocking federal government laws and actions they deem to exceed the constitutional powers of the national government. In one of the videos we watched, it explained how the 14th Amendment guarantees that states treat people equally. So this gets really muddy because states have power over marriage laws. So some states might say that gay marriage is allowed and some may say that it's not, but the 14th Amendment says that everyone should be treated equally. So it's an argument of interpretation over is gay marriage and allowing it, treating people equally, or not allowing it, treating people unequally. Next, implied powers. These are powers that are not mentioned explicitly by name in the Constitution, but instead are necessary and proper for carrying out the express powers which are written out in the Constitution. These include the power to create a national bank, create national draft, and conduct investigations. In the textbook, it explains that these powers do not need each in a specific clause because they are essential to the running of the country, and therefore there's essentially no need to spell them out. For instance, the controlling of state borders and the power to defend itself from internal revolutions or coups is obviously essential to the running of the nation. In one of the videos, it explained that marijuana-related crimes can be cause for arrests because the regulation of commerce between states is necessary for the running of the nation, even though marijuana laws are a state-by-state issue.
So the Supremacy Clause is in Article 6 of the Constitution, and it basically says that the federal law takes priority over state law. So if a state passes something that conflicts with the national law or the Constitution, the federal law will always win. This is what keeps the legal system consistent across all of the states. It just basically makes sure that states cannot go above and pass laws that contradict national policy. In the textbook, Chapter 3, Section 3.1, it explains how this clause is key to maintaining federal authority. What stood out to me, honestly, was how early Supreme Court cases helped define what this actually looks like in practice. That's pretty interesting to me. And another thing is that when I was watching the video from Hip Hughes for Article 6, he broke it down into three parts: debt, supremacy, and oath. And something to me that was interesting about that was how even the oath part reinforces that everyone in government is bound to the Constitution first, not to the state. So I think that really does show how deep this clause runs in shaping how our system works.
Okay, so the elastic clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it's the part that says Congress can make laws that are necessary and proper in order to carry out its powers. Basically, it gives the federal government some flexibility, even if something isn't necessarily spelled out word for word in the Constitution. They can still act on it if it's tied to one of the listed powers. For example, in the textbook, Chapter 3, Section 3.0, or 3.2, sorry, it explains how this clause is a foundation for implied powers. What stood out to me in this part of the textbook is how it's used to justify things, like for example creating a national bank. Even though it's not directly mentioned in the textbook, it does show how this clause plays a huge role in what the government can actually do. Also, along with the short video called The Elastic Clause Explained in 3 Minutes, which by Hip Hughes, what I liked about it is how he broke down the connection between the Elastic Clause and the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that powers not given to the federal government do go to the states, but the Elastic Clause kind of stretches that, like it kind of gives some flexibility. So it lets Congress do more as long as it's connected to their existing powers. That tension between state and federal power is a big part of how our system works. Okay, so when Congress passes a law, that's just the initial starting point. Most laws don't include like all the details. It's just kind of laid out like in a big picture. So from that big picture come executive agencies like the EPA or FDA, and they basically just take over and figure out how to actually enforce it. The textbook covers this in chapter 15, section 15.4. It essentially explains how these agencies, which are a part of the federal bureaucracy, write the specific rules that turn these super like generalized laws into something people can actually follow. What stood out to me when reading the textbook was a lot of this happens outside of Congress, which is really interesting. It's mainly a lot of career staff that kind of are behind the scenes of all of this, that are doing the drafting, the revising, and the reviewing. So I think that's really interesting, and not a lot of people know that. And I think this idea really came together for me when I was watching a short video by the Federalist Society, which basically broke down how agencies implement the laws. It not only showed how they start with the basic language from Congress, but then also after some time, maybe months or a couple of years, they start developing draft regulations. If the rule has a big economic impact, they have to do what's called a full cost benefit analysis, just so that then they can kind of cover all the bases, which is really interesting. Once the draft is ready, it then gets published into the Federal Register so the public can weigh in. Anyone can submit comments, and the agency has to take those into account before finalizing the rule on the law. And then after more review, the final version gets published and becomes an enforceable law. So even though Congress passes the law, it's really the agencies that make it happen. Like they're the ones that pass the law and like review it and all of that behind the scenes, which is really, really interesting.
How regulatory laws are enforced. According to Kreutz, in the American Government, Chapter 14, State and Local Government, and Chapter 60, Domestic Policy, the enforcement of regulatory laws is one of the main responsibilities of both federal and state administrative agencies. Once Congress or a state legislator passes an enabling law, agency like Environmental Protection Agency, which is known as EPA, or a state department of health create like specific regulations to carry out the law. Pretty much these agencies then monitor, inspect, and investigate to make sure like people and organizations are following the rules. And then in the textbook, Kreutz explains that enforcement happens through a combination of oversight, penalties, and compliance programs. So for example, Chapter 16, which is Domestic Policy, it describes how domestic policy areas like environmental protection, healthcare, or workplace safety relies heavily on agencies to enforce standards. The text also kind of like highlights that like states play a vital role in this process by implementing and enforcing federal rules at the local levels, such as like through state environmental agencies or public health departments, if that makes sense. How regulatory laws are adjudicated. Once a regulation is enforced, disputes sometimes arise over whether a rule was violated or whether an agency acted fairly. Kreutz, in the textbook American Government, explains in Chapter 14 that both state and federal governments rely on a system called administrative adjudication to handle these cases. So this process kind of like takes place within the agency itself rather than in regular courts at first. Agencies employ administrative law judges who actually conduct hearings, review evidence, and issue decisions about whether a regulation was properly applied. And in Chapter 60, The author discusses how these adjudications are actually especially important in domestic policy fields such as labor, environment, and health, where agencies must balance public safety with individuals or business rights. Pretty much the whole key idea is that this process gives individuals a fair chance to challenge agency actions while keeping the system efficient.
So the separation of power is supposed to keep the government balanced, right? You have the Congress, which makes the laws. You have the president that enforces them, and then you have the courts or the Supreme Court, which interprets them. And then you have the regulatory agencies, which comes in and kind of, I guess, messes with that balance. You have agencies like the Securities and Exchange Committee, the SEC, or the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, where they come in and they make rules and they enforce them, and then they settle these disputes, which pretty much is a job of all three, right? Of all three branches. And so regulatory agencies were created by Congress to tackle like these modern issues that are too complex for like Congress themselves or just lawmakers in general to handle like every detail. So they delegate that power. Really, the problem is that they aren't elected, and many or some, I guess, are independent from the president or the executive branch and such. And so that kind of like hides accountability. It's very difficult to who you're going to point fingers to, really, other than the person behind the camera. And it just doesn't really, I don't think it really fits well with what the framers or our founding fathers had imagined for it. And for the future, I do think that us citizens, United States, will continue to benefit from these regulatory laws. I mean, these industries, especially like what happened in 2008, it keeps them safe, it keeps them fair and accountable, like OSHA as well, is one of the biggest ones. And it's, this is all due to our ever-growing economy, ever-growing country, our ever-growing just environments, and it just keeps everyone, I believe, safe, and it protects people. I mean, and with our country growing, I believe it is also flexible enough to keep things balanced as well. Not too bad. But yeah. So the Constitution can be amended in two steps. You have the proposal and the ratification. First, an amendment has to be proposed by a two-thirds vote in both the House and the Senate, or by a national convention called by two-thirds of the states. And then it has to be approved by 3/4 of the states to officially become part of the Constitution. And a few examples of constitutional amendments. You have the First Amendment, protects our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, religion, and press. And then you have the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery after the Civil War, and the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And the whole process is hard or difficult on purpose, as it keeps the Constitution stable. But as our world grows, it's still, the Constitution allows for change as our country continues to grow. And yeah.